Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our panel on the language and ethics of climate change. Oh, sorry, just Eva, how do I? Oh, we thought we got it all figured out here. I must have pressed something. There we go. I'll try not to touch this too much. Okay, so just very briefly, the motivations and aims behind today's panel. As I think has become clear over the course of the past day, climate crises will not and cannot be solved by science, technology, and policy alone. Instead, they require a diverse range of approaches and expertise. So I've asked our panelists today, whom I'll introduce momentarily, to discuss the importance of inclusive, transdisciplinary research, education, and social action to creating more effective climate solutions. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists. Each will be speaking for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion that will be moderated by Professor Cajetan Iheka. So I'm Karen Thornber. I'm Harry Tuchman Levin Professor in Literature and Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here at Harvard. Following me, or momentarily, Meg Parsons will be speaking. Professor Parsons is Associate Professor at the University of Auckland School of Environment, and she is joining us by Zoom. Following Meg is Professor Stephen Gardiner, Professor of Philosophy and Ben Rabinowitz Endowed Professor of Human Dimensions of the Environment at the University of Washington, Seattle. Following Stephen is Ajmal Khan AT, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Lakshmi Mittal and Family South Asia Institute here at Harvard. Following Ajmal will be Joni Adamson, President's Professor, Environmental Humanities at Arizona State University. And then wrapping us up is Professor Cajetan Iheka of Yale University, who will be leading our discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Parsons. Go ahead.
Kia ora. Hello from the wet Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Yesterday we exceeded our yearly rainfall. We've had, and there was emergency evacuation of everyone. Luckily, most people got out safe, but it's been very disruptive, and we've had so far 4 emergency warnings sent out on our phones in the last couple of months telling us to evacuate because of flooding. So the climate crisis is well and truly upon us. And it raises the things of that we need to go from theory into practice. With transdisciplinary approaches, a large portion of them talk about frameworks and methodologies, but there's limited practical examples, and there's a need for policies and on-the-ground actions which recognize the epistemological divides between Indigenous and colonizing peoples, and specifically in settler colonial societies like the US and New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and so on. And especially when we're finding also increasing and ongoing conflict between Indigenous peoples and the state or corporations over fossil fuel extraction, degradation, and widespread ongoing inequalities. And this is where Indigenous notions and practices of transdisciplinarity really can serve to benefit us all. And first things to note is, as somebody who is Indigenous, but also of settler descent, I recognise the incredible wariness Indigenous communities have with research because of the history of it serving colonial interests and being highly extractive. And I included a whakataui, a proverb from the Maori language, which talks about bringing together different baskets of knowledge so the people and the wider ecosystems can thrive. And this notion of holism and interconnectivity and relationality is at the heart of Indigenous understandings of what transdisciplinarity is. Now, there's lots of examples going on in Oceania, the wider Pacific, Australia, and Aotearoa, to do with transdisciplinary research and education and on-the-ground actions. A lot of my research and involvement has been to do with Maori-led wetland and river restoration projects. New Zealand, about 90% of our rivers and lakes are unswimmable. They're so polluted that you can't safely swim in them, and there's huge loss of biodiversity. It's been a consequence of ongoing deforestation, but also drainage of wetlands. We've lost 92% of our wetlands in the last 50 years. And a large portion of efforts by individual tribal groups have been working with scientists, Maori researchers, to restore wetlands and rivers, recognising that wetlands absorb carbon. They act to reduce flooding and drought risk, and they also serve as important cultural and spiritual sites and provide food resources and other resources for local communities. The other thing which is going on is a huge emphasis on collaborating, Maori researchers collaborating with non-Maori, including with artists, to look at how to communicate climate change complexity through art and collaborative community artworks, such as the photo you can see here, showing school children who've attended a workshop to do with the impacts of climate change on their marine environment. And then they create artworks out of discarding bits of ropes and plastics you would commonly find in the ocean. And it's a way to educate children, but also communicate Indigenous understandings of relationships and connectivity between the social and ecological systems. Now, there's various other ones going on throughout the Pacific, which seeks to draw on Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific knowledge to improve weather forecasting in Pacific Islands, specifically places like Fiji and Vanuatu, which lack detailed weather forecasts or the technologies to prepare for and manage cyclone risk. And they're doing so very successfully. And at the heart of this is also the need to move beyond knowledge integration. Rather than trying to take small bits of Indigenous knowledge, specifically environmental facts or process, practices, and merge it into scientific or Western knowledge systems, Indigenous peoples emphasize the need for knowledge to coexist and be in conversation with one another. And that with the recognition that we're in the Anthropocene and we're facing these multiple forms of ecological crises, including climate change, it's harder to ignore that Western approaches alone are not sufficient. And there's increasingly emphasis on local and Indigenous knowledges. And all this research and education and action is involving mutual relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners, and a shift away from seeking to extract or harvest Indigenous knowledge. And all these projects centre on Indigenous commitments to work collaboratively on solution-focused approaches to complex social ecological problems, which is at the heart of the climate crisis. And cover diverse dimensions critical to change-orientated research and education, and also transformative policies and practices. And environmentally damaging processes, and also, which also diminished Indigenous sovereignties and identities and health, were generated and linked into colonialism and contemporary capitalism. So Indigenous-led projects which are grounded in Indigenous knowledge and laws and targeting redress and restoration and climate risk reduction are inherently decolonising, because decolonisation requires change from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and collaborations are desirable because they bring those different knowledge systems together in a context where they can be reciprocally influencing each other. And all this work is designed to restore balance and bring balance and health and well-being to whole systems, rather than which overcomes the fragmentation and the implementation of like changes. And it really emphasizes that the need for holistic approaches which take into account power imbalances, histories, and multiple knowledge systems in a relational, in a respectful manner. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, May. I'm going to pass it over now to Stephen Gardiner.
So thank you all for coming, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. A 5-minute talk is basically a philosopher's nightmare. So to cope with that, I'm going to introduce a couple of central ideas and lean heavily on analogies. So the first idea is about the role of ethics in policy. Suppose you're building a house. The contractor says she will do the foundations, then the basic structure, fill in the floors, walls, and doors, and then call in the plumber. Obviously, this is a silly way to go about building a house. Plumbing is essential, and if you leave it until the last minute, you risk a great deal of trouble and expense. You may even be forced to rip down what you've already built and to start again. My point is that the same is true with ethics in climate policy. Ethics is at the heart of the goals of climate policy and also deeply implicated in the acceptable means to achieving those goals. This implies that it should be there from the beginning and is essential to research and to good education. I know that some in climate policy circles are skeptical about the role of ethics, so let me offer a couple more focused examples to illustrate why ethics is needed. Consider mainstream climate targets, such as Paris's 1.5 and 2 degrees. Currently, we are far from being on track for meeting those targets. However, even what would count as officially being on track is deeply worrying. To see this, I offer another analogy. Imagine a parent-teacher conference. The teacher says that your child is not yet on track to graduate from high school. You ask, what counts as being on track? The teacher replies, well, it's a technical term, meaning that the probability of graduation is 50 to 66%. This is for the average child. The rate of failure is much greater for high-risk students. Unfortunately, we have no firm information about whether your child is high risk. Moreover, the projections assume that every student develops linearly over time, but we know that some students go into downward spirals from which it can be challenging to rebound. Alas, it's difficult to predict to whom such spirals will occur or when. On a more positive note, we are hopeful that new teaching technologies will dramatically improve outcomes. These technologies are speculative and have not yet been tested. Nevertheless, our probability assessments already assume that they will work and take up much of the burden of helping students graduate. My guess is that you'll be shocked by these revelations and outraged by the misleading nature of the original on-track remark. Probably you would sound the alarm and demand that the school take stronger, more decisive action, including by providing better safety margins and a higher standard of care. If so, you are primed to join a climate activist organization. But the teacher's explanation is worryingly similar to one that you would get from someone explaining mainstream climate targets. If you're worried about 50 to 60% chances, average cases, linear projections, and building in speculative technologies, all of these are essential to the mainstream idea of what it is to be on track. The core issue here, I think, is that the mainstream approach seems unethical. It does not appear to give appropriate weight to the future. It seems to amount to a severe abdication of responsibility. Sorry, that went too fast. My third point involves the need for ethics in how we model the climate problem. The dominant model in economics and international relations is that climate change is a multi-person prisoner's dilemma or tragedy of the commons played out between nation states. I have critiqued that idea and provided an alternative in my book, A Perfect Moral Storm. At the heart of the critique is the idea that the dominant model obscures the ethical dimensions of the climate problem. It is, if you like, ethics poor. The main failings of the prisoner's dilemma model illustrate the importance of inclusion. The first is that the model ignores skewed vulnerabilities, the fact that those least responsible for climate change tend to be the most vulnerable to climate impacts, whereas those most responsible tend to be among the least vulnerable, at least in the short to medium term. A second failing is that the prisoner's dilemma model ignores the context of background injustices, which profoundly affect how the climate problem must be understood in the real world. A third failing is that the prisoner's dilemma model ignores the intergenerational dimension of climate change, and in particular, that the most salient collective action problem is probably what I call the tyranny of the contemporary, not the prisoner's dilemma. A final failing is that the prisoner's dilemma model ignores the fact that the climate problem encourages moral corruption, and especially self-serving distortions of the way we think about the climate problem. In being ethics poor, the prisoner's dilemma model may be a prime example. This brings us back to the importance of inclusion. It is easy for decision-making to become dominated by a narrow range of voices with limited perspectives. This is most visible when there is neglect of the influence of existing environmental injustices, and especially those strongly related to race, class, gender, indigeneity, nationality, and so on. Since my colleagues on the panel will probably highlight these, let me emphasize the risk of intergenerational exclusion. Here, the potential victims, the very young and other future generations, are not even capable of making claims on their own behalf, and so risk a particularly deep kind of marginalization. Thus, they rely on us, members of the current generation, to defend them. The same is true of non-human species. Let me conclude with two positive suggestions. In my view, one clear best practice is what is sometimes called embedded ethics. Ethical concerns and expertise should be incorporated into projects and policies early on and evolve with those projects. Ethics is like plumbing or electricity. The key is to think about it early and often. Fortunately, climate ethics is a robust area of inquiry with a rich literature. It should thus be seen as an essential part of good policy and governance work in climate change and a necessary component of an adequate education for today's students, especially in policy areas. If you'd like a basic introduction, you might see my new book, Dialogues on Climate Justice, which aims to make some of the key ideas accessible to a wide audience through following the career and conversations of a young climate activist called Hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, organizers, for having me here. As we meet here in the pleasant Cambridge today, most part of South Asia, that includes India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Afghanistan, are experiencing one of the hottest summers, along with deadly heat waves. Last month, in the India's financial capital, Mumbai, 13 people died and more than 500 people were hospitalized out of sunstroke in an open-air award event. Last week, the India's Meteorological Department informed that a low-pressure area formed over the southeast Bay of Bengal is expected to intensify into a cyclone named Mocha and likely to move towards the Bangladesh-Myanmar coast later this week. Out of extreme weather events alone, and only between 1917 to 2019, as many as 1.5 lakh people died out of heat waves, cold waves, floods, lightning, tropical cyclones. And in India alone, in 2022, every day had an extreme weather event that claimed more than 3,000 lives and affected 1.8 billion hectares of crop areas. Now, this created socioeconomic and political challenges, as South Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world with largest share of the poor population in the world, whose major share is dependent on natural resources for survival. On the other hand, these very communities protect the environment. For example, 5% of the world's population, who are the indigenous population, still protect nearly 80% of the Earth's biodiversity in the forest, deserts, grasslands, and the marine environments in which they have been living for centuries. My research is centered around this crisis, where globally climate justice emerged as a major framework, acknowledging the disproportionate burden experienced by the countries and communities that are least responsible for the anthropogenic climate change. However, climate justice within countries that are most unequal societies in the world, such as India, has not gained enough attention in the climate change scholarship and policy. My current research looks at climate justice within India, considering caste and the indigenous or the Adivasi identity as two socio-ecological complexities in the subcontinent. Based on the ethnographic fieldwork among the Adivasi and Dalit farmers in the world's largest area of mangrove forest in the Bay of Bengal, Sundarbans, and the Kuttanad Delta region in South India, my work is an effort to highlight the limits of universal frameworks of climate justice in regions like South Asia. I demonstrate how unique forms of injustice, inequalities, and their multiple intersections and the intertwined socio-ecological relations determine and mediate the experience of climate change in India. I then argue that for regions like South Asia would need alternative climate justice frameworks and climate change mitigation plan adaptation policies informed by these local complexities, such as caste as well as the Adivasi identity. Last year, the northeastern state of Assam of India was flooded, and 197 people lost their lives, and the floods damaged a huge area of crops. The sanitation workers who come from the bottom of caste hierarchy in India, who are called as the Safai Karamcharis, had to unclog the drain and wash off the city of Guwahati. In the floods in the South Indian state of Kerala, which some of you might have seen in the news, which happened in 2018 and 19, demonstrated how Dalit and Adivasi communities were not only disproportionately affected, but also faced caste discrimination during rescue and rehabilitation. In the state of Odisha and Tamil Nadu, in the context of multiple cyclones in the past few years, and during Cyclone Fani in 2019, it was documented that how Dalit families were not informed about the cyclone on time, and then during cyclone, they were denied entry into the cyclone shelters constructed by the government. Dalit and the Adivasi communities have fewer adaptation resources to combat the damages from the events related to climate change as compared to other caste groups, and continue to be deprived of socio-economic and political right and systemic discrimination that exists during climate risk preparedness, during a climate stress, and in the rehabilitation initiative post those events. In the recently concluded United Nations Climate Change Conference in Egypt, India spoke eloquently about the international climate justice and the loss and damage funds that developed countries have to contribute to the UNFCCC processes. However, India does not address the internal climate justice and inequalities within. How do we think about loss and damage in South Asia when our society is based on caste that ensure permanent loss and damages to certain communities? What about the loss and damage of Dalit communities, Adivasis, backward caste groups, nomadic groups, pastoral groups and traditional small scale and small and the marginal farmers and the urban poor in India. Can the government of India acknowledge that the caste oppressed communities have disproportionate losses and damages? Do these communities have any rights over the loss and damage fund? Though India has a national climate action policy which was adopted in 2009, all the states that have climate action policies as well now, and the caste and the vulnerabilities of caste oppressed communities are not part of most of these action plans. Along with class, gender, and race, caste need to be acknowledged as a category by the UN frameworks conventions on climate change. India should recognize caste and the climate vulnerabilities of the caste oppressed communities and initiative measures to protect them. And these efforts should also be part of the national and the state climate action policies. These special vulnerabilities should also be integrated into the disaster and climate risk management plans, governance, climate risk preparedness plan, climate impact relief assistance programs, and social protection coverages in the context of climate change in South Asia. Beyond that, there should also be separate climate action plans and implementation fund for caste oppressed communities, mushrooming climate and the energy sustainability initiative across the country, mostly led by the upper caste and Savarna professionals who are distant from the caste realities, is another challenge for caste to get any importance in these spaces. It's also crucial that the climate justice movement in India, mostly led by the upper caste and Savarna youth from the major Indian metros, genuinely integrate environmental and caste justice into questions into their campaigns. They also need to have honest conversation with the ongoing Dalit, Adivasi, Bahujan movements across the country that have been raising the issues of water, forest, land, and the environmental rights and dignity for centuries in India and South Asia. Thank you.
These are his slides. Do you want to see?
So the first one is actually the first one, which I kind of show for those of you who don't have an idea about the caste system in India, that broadly looks like this, where people are categorized hierarchically. And second one are massive newses which were reported actually in like one of those floods where how did people go discriminated against. This again, this is like a celebration of the Indigenous Peoples Day actually in one of the villages, which I don't have a lot of time to talk about anyway now. Yes. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to quickly go over the global developments in humanities inclusive sustainability research since 2000. And essentially, I want to thank Stephen and Ajmal for their presentations, because I don't really have to tell you a lot about what the environmental humanities is, because they demonstrated it very well. And I want to just, build on Stephen's metaphor, which is thank you, Karen, and the Salata Institute for inviting humanists to this conference. We noted in the year 2000 that the IPCC and other international science bodies rarely invited humanists to their gatherings. And so this presentation is going to be about how we scaled up for influence and impact by networking several ways in the last 2 decades. But to use your metaphor, thank you, Karen, for putting in the plumbing first at this inaugural meeting of the Salata Institute. So in 2012, the outcome document of the United Nations Rio 20+20 Sustainability Conference was themed "The Future We Want," and we've heard this theme, iterated in many meetings. But it was particularly impactful for humanists because we heard in that document, the first clarion calls for change in the way environmental research was done. Specifically, delegates called for the integration of humanities and arts into the natural and sustainability research. So in my collection called Humanities for the Environment, I go over what the environmental humanities is and how we've been scaling up our response to what is often called the Anthropocene. We've come up with many different names to alternative names for that. We don't necessarily call it the Anthropocene, but essentially in this book, I cover our field genealogy and sort of note that environmental humanists have been in this space for over 40 years. So, you know, when we find ourselves not invited to, say, the IPCC, we have always been asking why. You know, we've been in this space for many, many decades. So why are we not invited into this space? So in pursuing that question, the Mellon Foundation and the Consortium for Humanities Centers and Institutes seed funded a global project called Humanities for the Environment, which was innovated at Arizona State, my university. And we were working with two partners, Trinity College Dublin and University of Sydney, to begin this project that would network the environmental humanities around the world. And so I won't go over the details of this, but please come onto our website. It's called Humanities for the Environment, and take a look at our projects. We began workshopping new ideas, narratives, frameworks, and alternative imaginaries, specifically focused on humanities leadership in trying to tease out what we mean when we say a future we want. Specifically, Humanities for the Environment is project-oriented and community-facing. It values traditional ecological knowledges. So Meg, thank you so much for your presentation. Meg's presentation was also really key, I think, in helping us sort of understand why we've networked around the world and why Indigenous knowledges are so important to this project. By 2015, we had scaled up to 8 observatories around the world. And you saw where there are, one in Asia, one in Latin America, you know, and we're still scaling up to organize humanists, social scientists, natural scientists, artists, engineers, and health scientists, as well as first Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples, on questions like how can the humanities and arts contribute uniquely to the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in this very key decade for action. In 2021, we became even more, I should say, Humanities for the Environment stepped into an even more prominent role internationally when we became one of the 3 co-founding partners of Bridges, which is the UNESCO Sustainability Science Coalition of the Management of Social Transformations program. So humanities officially is recognized within the UNESCO Ecology of Programming, and we called ourselves Bridges to indicate the aim to bridge the humanities with the sciences, or integrate the humanities into the sciences, or rather lead with the humanities in the sciences for you know what we're calling sustainability science. So again, putting the plumbing in first, so that we're asking all the right questions as we begin to innovate our projects. So this is the first humanities-centered global coalition for knowledge and action within the UNESCO ecology, and it brings together over 40 partners, including Future Earth and the International Science Council. It includes universities, NGOs, private foundations, and Indigenous communities to explore how the humanities, arts, and traditional ecological knowledges contribute to the achievement of these SDGs that we would like to see achieved by 2030 and hopefully by 2050. But the point is that Bridges is now considered the go-to resource within UNESCO for expertise, advice, engagement, endorsement from the humanities on sustainability science, education, policy, and action. And I guess I want the takeaway point here to be that for over 40 years, you know, humanists go to a meeting and they say, where are the humanists? And then, you know, we hear scientists say, we know the humanities need to be here. It's just that we don't know how to do that. And so I think that one of the great things about becoming the UNESCO Bridges Sustainability Coalition is now we have a recognized place to go. So hopefully if you hear anybody asking, where are the humanities, here's a place to go for that expertise. Each one of the Bridges Humanities Labs, there's 5 sister labs around the world, have a signature project. At ASU, where I'm at, our signature project is called the Bridges Humanities Labs. And essentially what we want to do is we want to teach undergraduate students who will be the leaders going into the next decades on climate change. We want to teach them how to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So you hear all the time about interdisciplinary research, but we want to teach our students how to walk the walk. So we put a humanist instructor together with a non-humanist instructor so that they can teach together and model how people from different disciplines work together. It's really hard, actually. Any of you who've actually done it know that it is very challenging to work with people not in your discipline. And so students see us in the classroom disagreeing with each other and sort of figuring out how to sort of get past maybe disagreement or obstacles. And then we put our students together with some funding. We give them funding to innovate solutions that they are imagining might help us achieve the SDGs. So that's my presentation in a nutshell. I wanted to just sort of briefly tell you how in 2 decades since the UN Earth Summit, environmental humanists have established these global networks that network tens of thousands, literally tens of thousands of environmental humanists with their colleagues in the sciences and social sciences to learn how to collaborate, research, and create community-facing projects that will have an actual sort of footprint in these struggles that we're facing as we go towards 2030 and then eventually 2050. Thank you.
I want to join my co-panelists to thank Professor Thornber for inviting us and making sure that this panel is part of the conversation at this conference. And I've been thinking about what Stephen said earlier about the plumbing analogy. And to bring that to fruition, we hope that when this happens again, that this would be one of the central panels, that it wouldn't be a breakout session, to recognize that, ethics really should be at the heart of the work of climate transitions that we're thinking about here. So first, I want to quickly really go over a few things that my colleagues have said, and then I will add a few things from the standpoint of Africa, which is the context within which I work. And one of the things that have come up consistently is this notion of co-knowledge production that is really fascinating, in the panels. Meg's paper talked about working together between indigenous knowledge and sciences, a kind of collaboration that is not extractive, but I think, that's really important for the kind of work that is important to move forward. Related to that, that's sense of collaboration is really how do we work with these communities all across the world who are affected tremendously by this problem. Ajmal's paper commenting on the experiences, the experience of lower caste peoples in India really brings this to the forefront. How do we collaborate in such environments? How do we make it possible that it's ethical and not extractive and mindful of the power dynamics that will bring, to these relationships? The other thing that came to mind for me as in listening to these papers is really the collaborative model that brings the humanities and sciences together, reflected in Joni's powerful presentation on institutional building, that our individual research matters, but a kind of collaboration that bridges and the humanities, humanities for the environment collaboratives are working on, really, they become really essential. Those institutional work remain essential. And this brings me ultimately to Stephen's presentation about really the centrality of, the centrality of ethics to these questions. Stephen used the plumbing analogy, which is powerful, but it's also making me think about communities that I visit when I'm back in Nigeria, where they don't even have plumbing, and that's part of what we should be thinking about as we move forward in these conversations. So, ethics is, it's the plumbing, but it's in fact, when we think about parts of the global south, places where Admal was talking about, places that I work with, we can say it's really the foundation. It should be the foundation of the work going forward, and that is really the point that has been elaborated and emphasized in the different presentations that we've heard today. How do we work together with these communities? To close, what I want to think about from the standpoint of Africa is really two words that really have come up today, but have also come up in really climate conversations more generally. And these are the notions of post-carbon and the notions of transition, post-carbon and transitions. And the question that this raises for me, and really when we think about the different presentations we've heard today, is post-carbon for who? Post-carbon for who? I think that is perhaps the most ethical consideration that we want to bring into this debate going forward. Post-carbon for who? Those of us who go between words, the words of Connecticut, United States, and the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. When you as you switch words, as I would do, next month when I travel for the summer, you begin to ask yourself to what extent the words and terminologies that we use in certain places, what would a post-carbon economy look like for people in the Niger Delta whose livelihoods have been wrecked, whose rivers have become polluted? We need to bear that in mind, as we pat ourselves on the back on the progress that we're making and the progress we want to make on clean energy, on electrification. How do we make sure that we don't leave behind these communities that the sacrifice zones, the disposable people that we've left behind as in our race, toward industrialization? And the same applies to the idea of transitions, as we transition, how do we think of those, who cannot be part of our transition because, they've lost their lives, in the process. They've transited actually away from this world in the process of, because of climate change, because of the impacts of climate change. So these ideas of these people who are left behind, they really come to mind as I'm thinking about ethics, so especially, the language of climate change. The language of climate change demands re-envisioning, demands remapping, demands rethinking. When we think about people in the global south, but also even in North America, when we think of indigenous communities who are left behind. So we can't forget those indigenous communities that, Joni Adamson's work, our research has focused on consistently over the years. The people that Admal, paid attention to in his presentation, and the kind of people that I think with and I talk to in my own work in the Niger Delta, who's post-carbon, who's transition. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Meg, Stephen, Ajmal, Joni, and Cajetan. These are just brilliant papers, and I think really bring to the fore a lot of the issues that are central to tackling climate change, climate justice, injustice, but that aren't discussed nearly enough. So with that, I see we have about 10 minutes remaining and like to open the floor to questions.
Hi, Karen Thornber, alum of the Graduate School of Education's Risk and Prevention Program, and I run a mission-driven innovation strategy consultancy that's very transdisciplinary. My question is to any of you that can answer this. When you're talking about colonizing knowledge, and let's say you're starting a new program, and the measurement and evaluation processes that are evaluating perhaps from a Western perspective. Can anyone speak to that about how it best to construct a measurement and evaluation methodologies from the beginning, from that sort of non-colonial approach?
Should I take this?
Go for it.
Do you want to take this?
Well,
Well, in our projects for Humanities for the Environment, we're not proposing that we're going to take our knowledge in. So we're proposing something that might look more like sort of, people going back and forth with knowledge, so that the knowledge is, no one group is producing the knowledge, but rather the people who live in place are the people who are the authorities. Wherever the place is, those are the people that are the authority. You might be able to bring in some knowledge, you might have some tools, but you go into the community and you say, what do you need? What do you want? Maybe we have some tools. How could we work together in a way? And I think Meg might be able to speak to this. Meg, you're on Zoom, so I don't know if this is okay that I'm calling you out like this. But I think you were talking in some really interesting ways about not extracting knowledge from Indigenous people, the Maori. And so I might defer a little bit to Meg for some insights on this, but at least with Humanities for the Environment, we're not talking about either extracting knowledge or imposing knowledge, but rather something that looks more like groups getting together. But Meg, do you want to? You made a point that I think is really we should re-emphasize from your talk.
I think show you this thing, which is a diagram that we created to do with working with between different stakeholders, different Maori tribal groups, and then communities to do with sort of transforming how we manage and govern marine spaces, things. And it represents the two different knowledges of waka Māori and then the people of the treaty or the settlers who came to Aotearoa, and that recognizing that between different tribal groups and between different disciplines within Western knowledge systems, there's diversity of knowledges, but also values and worldviews. And the key thing was finding that engagement, that bridge over a shared purpose between them. So the key thing in some ways is finding that with the net representing our common purpose. And a lot of it was actually emphasizing the ways in which we can have different knowledges. We need people who act as the enablers or who can bridge the divide and allow different groups to speak to one another, because not only is there a language difference sometimes, because I've also worked in Australia and throughout the Pacific, so I've had to have translators and linguists and so forth. But also, even if we're saying the same words, there's difference in meanings because of our different worldviews and experiences and disciplines. So in some ways, the key thing when not trying to wanting to colonize or extract knowledge is actually finding those people who can bridge the divide for you and allow for you to construct like a curriculum or a project which allows for different groups to be able to share their knowledge. And it's really a process of trust building as well. And the key thing is finding out and deciding what your common and shared purpose is that you're working towards to sort of co-produce, whether it is a curriculum, a project, or a policy. I think that's key. But I think one of the things that I encourage non-Indigenous peoples to things is just talk to people, like Indigenous communities, and in a respectful, but in a we call it a aroha, a love-filled things of showing them respect and love and allowing people to express their anger and their fears and their experiences about past negative things. And that's a way of sharing stories to build trust and therefore be able to share knowledges freely. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Megan and Joni. We have about 3-4 minutes left, so maybe we take 2-3 questions and then the panelists can respond. I think I saw a hand here first, and then I'll come to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights. My question was, I'm really interested in hearing more about power dynamics. So when we are presented with the dichotomy, say, of Indigenous knowledge and, scientific, contemporary state-of-the-art techniques, or, tradition versus hierarchies in society that are embedded or entrenched in the way society was organized in, say, the case of South Asia. And what I sort of keep coming up against is, the power imbalance, if you will, that makes, certain systems more credible or more, I would say, authoritative, if for the lack of a better word. And I'm wondering, in terms of introducing ethics and language as a way to discuss this, how would you all feel like we can address the basic problem of power imbalance and inequities in these sort of conversations?
All right, thank you. We'll take one more question if you can keep it brief.
Very brief. So I see that like the modern world is struggling with techniques and the ways to deal with the natural disasters and all that crisis. And this is the whole point that, it's referring back to the knowledge of the Indigenous people, thinking that, we need that knowledge, we need that information because there is an experience over there and there is a bond and a connection. And then come back to the, arena and saying that, well, we know that this is important because we need that knowledge. We don't know how to deal with that. So we need your information. And then reflecting it back to the globe as, how can we help you? What's your problem? How can we fix your problems? Because you're so vulnerable. So where does this fit into the ethics of the climate?
Okay, very quickly.
Okay, so I was thinking about the doctrine of discovery being renunciated recently by the Vatican, and I'm really curious to know, because of the conquerors and colonization and everything, how that might be fitting in terms of power structures and into this work.
All right, thank you. Any take us for any of these questions?
Can't work with me.
I just want to acknowledge how critical those questions are. They're so key. Those are the questions. Maybe even without answering the questions, I just want to acknowledge that the questions are so important. Those are the really important questions that we have to ask whenever we work in community. So I don't necessarily have the answers, but I just want to acknowledge that those are the questions that have to be asked at the beginning of each project. And what the humanities want to do is they want to ask better questions, more questions, critically important questions. So, you know, that's the reason why we have to be there at the beginning of the project, so that we can ask all the critical questions that need to be asked. So thank you so much for your questions.
Yeah, and I think one of the things tying these questions together too is the importance of humility when we come to science, because part of the argument is that the science is fact based but the kind of renunciations you're talking about, this rethinking of ideas in science, tells us again that science is a narrative. It's storytelling in a particular way, which is often renounced. Just today, the New York Times headline, as I was looking through my phone, says there's a recommendation that women start doing mammogram at 40 now, not 50 anymore. That was revised in 2009 from 40 to 50. So I think science being a narrative. So that humility is something that I want to bring into this conversation. And when we recognize that, the so-called hierarchy, the so-called importance of certain knowledge systems over others, I think fall by the wayside. And the last question, the question here about really the rescue, I think this ties to what Megan said earlier about this extraction that we go to indigenous knowledge when we're stuck, when we're in trouble, and then we move on, and then somehow, and then take those and really repackage them as something that belongs to us. So I think, scientific humility is important, and then making sure that the collaboration endures and is not instrumental or extractive, as Meg has told us. Yes. Okay.
Thanks. You're asking the impossible question in a certain way, but I want to say two very quick things, as we only have a minute. One is, I think we need to be very careful of the dangers of stark skepticisms that sometimes lie behind those kinds of questions. Often it can be used as a way of shutting down the importance of ethics and justice. And I don't think we should concede too early, or I don't think we should concede at all. I think ethics, you need ethics and justice to even understand why climate change is much of a problem. Right? If you don't have those lenses, it's very odd to say why it's a problem. The second thing I want to say is just other things have power. Institutions have power, and norms have power, ethical aspirations have power. Some of the most powerful things in human societies, I think, are when serious claims of injustice are made and people react to those, and they generally recognize that there are problems there. Then they often result in struggles around power. But that doesn't mean that the claims of injustice never win or that they don't have any power of their own. And so I think we should keep that firmly in mind. And we see that in other areas of public life all the time. And transformations occur. Look around this room. Does this room look like what it would have looked like 100 years ago? I don't think so.
Okay, so we are unfortunately out of time. I would just like to say again, thank you so much, Meg, for joining us all the way from New Zealand, as well as Stephen, Ajmal, Joni, and Cajetan for sharing with us this afternoon just a bit of the hugely important work that they've been doing, asking these really difficult questions, not so we can get depressed and get deeper into skepticism, but rather to encourage us, to motivate us, to keep us asking these questions and providing some answers to these questions, creating new knowledge as we go. Just finally, I'd like to say a huge thank you to the Salata Institute for asking me to organize this panel this afternoon. I think we, in the humanities, the arts, have a real friend in Vice Provost Jim Stock, and I'm really grateful for all of his support and look forward to future conversations with you all and with our audience. And with that, I will say thank you very much.